28,000 people lie dead, and the Caribbean's most prosperous city had been completely wiped off the map. This only took 35 seconds to occur, with this major event happening this month exactly 123 years ago. I am not referring to some unknown major battle, but rather the single deadliest volcanic disaster in human history within the entire northern hemisphere. What I am referring to is the major 1902 eruption of Mount Pelee on the Caribbean island of Martinique, which would wipe out the city of Saint-Pierre. This is the story of the tragedy at Saint-Pierre, where tens of thousands perished due to a destructive pyroclastic flow and surge at 8:02 a.m. local time on May 8, 1902. But first, a bit of context. Like all volcanoes in the Caribbean, Mount Pelee exists due to the offshore collision of two tectonic plates to the east. There, the South American plate is subducting underneath the Caribbean plate. Partial melting then occurs on the subducted crust, causing molten rock to rise upwards, intruding into the Caribbean plate before rising to the surface and erupting, forming a chain of volcanoes. The Pelee volcano is the youngest and only active volcanic edifice on the French island territory of Martinique, rising approximately 1,397 meters or 4,583 feet above sea level on the northwest portion of the island. The Pelee volcanic complex has been active for 550,000 years, although the first 77% of this time span involved the construction of the precursor Montagne Pelee, also known as Mount Cono, to the northwest. The modern cone of Mount Pelee formed entirely during the last 127,000 years, formed by numerous explosive eruptions that deposited overlapping layers of lava and ash, albeit primarily ash. The modern cone of the explosive Mount Pelee volcano almost solely erupts andesite, and I want to note that this is very close compositionally to the basaltic andesite lava which constructed the not very explosive Belknap Crater shield volcano in Oregon. However, despite the minor silica content difference between the two volcanoes, there is a far more important difference that made one volcano mildly explosive at worst, while the other volcano became highly explosive. And that difference is that Pelee's magma chamber contains substantially more volatile compounds, specifically water and carbon dioxide, resulting in its eruptions being far more explosive than its shield volcano counterpart. As a result, Pelee in the Holocene epoch, spanning the time period since 9700 BCE, ranks fourth in its sheer number of highly explosive VEI4 or larger eruptions among approximately 1,300 active and potentially active world volcanoes. In other words, Pelee since 9700 BCE has produced 20 explosive eruptions of a similar or larger size than its deadly 1902 eruption, averaging an increase rate of once every 250 years during the last 2,500 years. It even ranks far higher than other well-known notoriously explosive volcanoes in the Holocene such as Vesuvius and Mount St. Helens. For reference, a VEI4 eruption ejects greater than or equal to 100 million but less than 1 billion cubic meters of tephra and has an eruption column that rises to more than 10 kilometers or 32,808 feet. The 1902 eruption of Pelee, for example, ended up being essentially 10% the size of the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. These major Holocene eruptions were either Plinian, involving a sustained 20-kilometer or higher eruption column, or Pelean, involving the creation and then violent destruction of lava domes, creating widespread pyroclastic flows often focused on one specific sector of the volcano. It should come as no surprise that Mount Pelee's name was used for the basis of the term Pelean eruption, and its 1902 eruption was one such example of this. There is also another crucial fact regarding the geologic history of Mount Pelee. Do you see the numerous deep drainages and ravines that run down the volcano's western and southwestern flanks? These are not simply ordinary river channels, as there is a very specific reason why they are so much deeper here than the river channels which exist descending other sectors of the volcano, as these valleys represent the remnants of three horseshoe-shaped collapse scars that mark major summit collapses of much of the volcano. The first collapse occurred 127,000 years ago, the second collapse 25,000 years ago, and the third and most recent collapse, highlighted here, occurred 9,000 years ago. while each of these subsequent collapses involved a decreasing amount of volume, thus suggesting that such events might be getting less common due to increased stability in the overall volcano, their existence would cause a major problem regardless. Simply put, various major eruptive hazards during future eruptions, that being hypothetical lengthy lava flows, lahars, and pyroclastic flows, would be preferentially directed towards the southwest and west as a result, including where the city of Saint-Pierre would be eventually constructed. And I'm not even going to get into the presumed regional tsunamis that past major collapses which involve between 2 and 13 cubic kilometers of rock created. Fast forwarding to 1902, while modern geological sciences were developing, modern volcanology for all intents and purposes would not truly begin for another decade. In other words, the people at the time who attempted to analyze the volcano or who used incorrect so-called common knowledge can't be blamed for having quote-unquote known what we now determine in hindsight to be incorrect information. Martinique at the beginning of 1902, which for reference had 73% of the landmass the Hawaii's island of Oahu did, had a population of approximately 200,000 residents. Of this total, 17,000 lived in the capital city of Fort-de-France, but the most populous, wealthiest, and most economically important city on the island was Saint-Pierre, with a population of 26,000. Before the eruption began, Saint-Pierre looked like this. Quite a nice place to live, while also being wealthy and peaceful. So, what about the nearby Mount Pelee volcano? What did the locals and government know about it at the time? Well, the locals in 1902 were largely already aware that Pelee was a volcano, with knowledge it produced small eruptions in both 1792 and from 1851 to 1852. The 1792 eruption was purely phreatic, involving a series of small explosions solely confined to Pelee's summit crater. The 1851 to 1852 eruption was an order of magnitude more explosive, as it likely involved minor amounts of magma destroying vegetation in and around the summit crater in phreatomagmatic explosions. Yet, apart from a minor dusting of ash, the people nearby were largely unaffected. That is why when Pelee erupted again in 1902, people initially felt a full sense of security due to the knowledge preceding lower intensity eruptions did not directly impact anyone nearby, let alone in Saint-Pierre, 7 kilometers or 4.3 miles away from its summit. However, there were warning signs dating all the way back to 1889 hinting that something was likely different this time. Whereas, in prior decades, the summit was essentially devoid of degassing from various fumaroles, after 37 years of no activity, gas vents suddenly became active at Pelee's summit in 1889. This weak degassing was continuous for the next 13 years until something else changed during the first week of January 1902. The degassing plume from said fumaroles slowly became more and more substantial as the weeks progressed, and soon people even multiple kilometers away were smelling the stench of sulfur in the air. This marked the presence of intermediate depth rising magma sending volumes of both hydrogen sulfide and sulfur dioxide gas to the surface. Then, on April 23rd, the first tremors began occurring due to the rise of magma which was now at shallow depths. It was not long until later in the day Pelee's summit crater generated its first small-scale explosions of the 20th century. Initially, just like in the prior two eruptions, its effects only impacted the summit crater and the area immediately surrounding it where no one lived. Regardless, phreatic eruptions had begun, and these would get more substantial over the following days. These explosions were caused largely due to the fact that Pelee's summit crater was filled with a small crater lake. On April 27th, several locals climbed to investigate themselves, noting that the crater lake was now highly acidic, much of it was actively boiling or near boiling, and there was a violently degassing 10-meter-high volcanic cone within the center of it. As eruptive activity slowly escalated, some nearby settlements began to start receiving a steady, albeit light fall of ash, something that did not occur during the two prior eruptions. The following day, several explosions an order of magnitude larger than the phreatic eruptions thus far happened, creating a 10,000-foot-high eruption plume and showering the surroundings with not just minor ash, but also some fragments of pumice larger than many of the coins used at the time. These explosions seemingly became larger during the subsequent 3 days, and then, on May 5th, the first part of this tragedy struck. At 1 p.m. local time on May 5th, a portion of the crater rim walls at Pelee's summit failed and broke away, causing what I estimate to be 800,000 tons of hot, highly acidic water mixed with ash to sweep down 2 of its major drainages, combining with material along the way to create a destructive lahar. This lahar eventually overtopped the riverbanks, going on to flood and wash away the Garonne factory, which was a rum distillery, killing 23 workers near Rivière Blanche. The second lahar segment then swept into low pressure, flooding it, washing away multiple structures, and resulting in 400 additional fatalities. Later, on May 6th, with no crater lake now present, an andesite lava dome began to grow there. As this lava dome continued to grow the following day, small parts of it were blown out in explosions, and an orange glow became visible from afar. At this point, the sensible newspapers did the right thing. Just kidding, they allegedly told everyone that it was completely safe to be in Saint-Pierre, despite the rapidly worsening conditions, and the fact that more than 400 people had already died. Even the local government downplayed the severity of the situation, and as ash continued piling up closer to the volcano, internal refugees from towns closer to Mount Pelee traveled to Saint-Pierre, increasing its population temporarily from 26,000 to 28,000. These people were under the false impression that the town of Saint-Pierre would be safe from any hazards the ongoing eruption could throw at them. They did not know how absurdly wrong that assessment was, despite being more than 4 miles away from the ongoing eruption of Mount Pelee. After a short period of quiet during the night, the sun rose at 5:34 a.m. on May 8, 1902, only to be closely followed by a series of closely spaced explosions from Pelee's summit. These unusually closely spaced blasts indicated the progressive weakening of the plug that had formed in its magma conduit from the sheer volume of molten rock involved in the building viscous andesite lava dome. As, unknown to everyone, pressure had been building underneath this lava dome for some time, and soon the vast majority of these volatiles would be catastrophically released. The time was now 7:59 a.m. on May 8, 1902, 60 seconds before the main cataclysm would strike Saint-Pierre. In only that amount of time, the deadliest volcanic catastrophe in the entire history of the Northern Hemisphere would strike, wiping out almost the entire 26,000-person population and 2,000 internal refugees there. Next week's video will resume this deadly tale, emphasizing how and exactly what happened during Pelee's infamous climactic phase of its eruption at 8 a.m. local time on May 8, 1902. So, stay tuned for part 2, which I plan to publish next Saturday at 11 a.m. local time in Phoenix, Arizona on May 24th. Once that video goes live, you will be able to find it linked here and in the video description. As a final note, I would like to thank this channel's patrons on Patreon and channel members on YouTube for helping to make these longer form videos possible.